When my wife and I had our twins in 2006, I think my wife read every parenting book on the market. She had stacks of them, and I read a few. But after the second or third, I just stopped reading them. I just didn't buy the new, approach to raising kids. I still don't. And that is, you have to hear your kids out. Hear their point of view, consider it. You compromise with them. You don't just draw a line in the sand. It's got to be worked out, and you got to be extra careful, not to damage their self-esteem, because they have very delicate self-esteem, and that can have, lifelong bad effects. So I didn't buy any of that. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe you have to love your kids more than anything in the world. I don't believe in hitting children. I don't believe you should be mean or nasty to your kids. And it's really important to make your kids feel, loved, secure, safe, and know that you're on their side no matter what. That you do, it's cliche, but you love them unconditionally. But my number one rule in parenting is that you don't negotiate with your kids. It's not a negotiation. You're the parent. You've been on this earth for decades. They're new to this world. They don't have the experience, the background, so you know better. So you don't give them a say. I mean, you can hear their point of view, but that's where you draw the line. I do think it's important. I think it's a good thing to give them the justification if they disagree with something that you've asked them to do or not do. I think it's good to tell them why. But you do that once, and if they push back, then you just cut it off, and that's when you say, "Because I said so." Once in a while, I do let the kids argue with me, and I do that very intentionally in certain circumstances, because I do think the ability to argue, to have a point of view, and sort of make your case, and do some back and forth arguing is actually good for it's a really important skill to have. Now, as a lawyer, I know in the business world, it's an extremely important skill to cultivate. So at times I do engage in arguments with my kids, but they've got to be sort of rational, logical arguments that have like a little bit of an intellectual tone to them, and that's okay. But for the most part, if I put down a rule or requirement or ask them to do something, it's not negotiable. And when the kids push back hard and are disrespectful, well, then you got to get in their face. You really do. You got to let them know that you're not going to tolerate that, and you got to be tough. And it's not an ego thing. It's not like, oh, they damaged your ego, or they made you, they might make you feel bad about your position or anything like that. It's not about that. It's about the fact that you love them, and they're better off if they know as a parent you're guiding them and you're responsible for them, and you're making decisions that are right for them. And that's something that's going to help them in terms of their feeling of security and safety. It's going to go a long way for them. The second point of what I would call old school parenting that I firmly believe in is, some kids, especially early on, they have some sort of quirky behaviors. And I'm not talking about, some kids have, psychological issues or mental issues that they are born with. And, those you got to take seriously. And those certainly, sometimes you need, professional help with. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sort of little odd behaviors, like just little quirks. And I think with those, the sort of the modern view of things like that is, well, you celebrate those. Those make your kid different. They make your kid stand out, and they shouldn't be so worried about conforming that they're gonna feel bad about their little quirks or their just kind of strange little behaviors they have. I think that's the wrong approach. I think that's not doing your kid any favor. I guess what I'm talking about, it's best if I give an example as opposed to trying to describe it. My son Christopher, he was, I would say, very well-adjusted kid, social, athletic, whatever. But he had some quirks, and I guess nowadays you define it as sort of tactile issues. just how things felt like on his skin. Like he really didn't like soap, lotions. He didn't like smells of even toothpaste. A lot of that. But in particular, I remember like even how clothes felt on him. When we were living in our old house, I think the twins were probably around 2 years old, and we had a park, just around the corner from our house, and this was, and we were going to go there. It was like the first really hot day of the year. It was kind of like probably, late May, early June, and it was like the first day where the temperatures were like in the high 80s or maybe 90. And we were getting ready, to take the kids to the park. We got them, we're getting them in their play clothes, and Christopher didn't want to put on a t-shirt. He wanted to wear his long sleeve shirt. So he definitely has some tactile issues. He also like very resistant to change. So he was so used to wearing long sleeve shirts all winter into spring. He just refused to put on a t-shirt. And I probably should have just addressed it right then and there. But, it was one of those things like, we're in a hurry to go. I was like, all right, fine, let's just go. So as we were walking along, we got to the park. I remember thinking like, I gotta like kind of address this now. I can't just let this go because it's just not good for him. So I pulled him aside and I said, look, Christopher, take a look around. You see, there's just tons of kids here. If you notice, every single one of them is wearing a short sleeve shirt. And you understand why? Because it's really hot out. And short sleeve shirts are cooler. You feel cooler than if you're wearing a long sleeve shirt. So I know, you don't like change and you wanted to wear your long sleeve shirt, but wearing that shirt, it makes you stand out in a bad way, right? It makes you kind of weird, that you don't want to wear a t-shirt. And being kind of weird, having your quirks, like that's not a good thing. I'm not saying like you got to be like everybody else in every way, but like, like letting yourself indulging this like quirk you have, like I don't like short sleeve shirts, I don't want to wear them. Like that's not good, okay? And so from here on in, you're going to wear, on hot days, you're going to wear a t-shirt. Do you understand? And he kind of nodded, and from then, he wore his t-shirts. But, I think that, I wasn't trying to be mean or make him feel bad about himself. But, if you kind of nip it in the bud early on, it doesn't become an issue. And it's certainly not something you should encourage, like, oh, my kid's so different and quirky. Now, that's not to say that, he or she need to conform to everybody else in terms of their interests, what they like to do, or just who they are as people. But as far as like these little idiosyncrasies, to the extent you can, you got to let kids know like that's not okay, not acceptable. Same thing with just giving them general feedback. I think the new approach to parenting is, again, so worried about, fracturing their very delicate egos. You just tell your kids, constantly support them. Everything they do is awesome. Don't criticize them. Don't tell them that something they created or some work they did in school or otherwise isn't awesome. Well, I don't agree with that. I also feel like if you never give your kid constructive feedback, then when you tell them that they did something wonderful or that you're proud of them, it starts to become meaningless. So as parents, that's our job. Because, out there in the real world, even once they get out in school, people aren't going to tell them everything they do is awesome. And if that's all they've ever heard from their mom and dad, then, when they get out there and they get some negative feedback or told that something they did wasn't acceptable or was disappointing, they're going to get resentful and bitter and blame the person who's giving them that feedback. It's not healthy. So just something to think about. So the fourth point I'd like to make in terms of, the benefits of old school parenting is you don't let your kids decide matters of spirituality while they're growing up in your house. That's up to the mom and dad to require of their kids. In our house, that means going to church on Sundays, reading the Bible together and making sure that we say our prayers at least once a day. Now, I don't believe you can, it doesn't make sense, it's illogical to say that you can make somebody believe something that they don't believe in. So I can't make my kids believe in God. If they, along the way, ever said, like, I just don't believe in God, my response would be, that's fine. I hope someday you change that. But in the meantime, you're still going to go to church, you're still going to read the Bible together, and you're still going to pray. We're Greek Orthodox, and from the time the kids were little, I required them during Lent, this is just a thing of the Greek Orthodox religion, to go to church on Friday nights for the Lenten services. And, when they were young in particular, they pushed back a lot. They yelled and screamed. A lot of times, Friday evenings were the time when the kids had birthday parties and, sporting events, soccer and that sort of thing. And they still were required to go, and they had to miss some of that stuff. Now, that's not to say that, we never made an exception, because that's not true. We did. At times we made exceptions, but for the most part, they were required to go to church, for Lenten services, regardless of whether they wanted to do something else. And as the years went on, they really appreciated those services more than I ever would imagine. I mean, I tried to make it fun by, after church we'd go out to a nice dinner, but they really now they look forward to it. And I've asked them very recently, hey guys, when you have your own families, are you going to require your kids to go to Friday night Lenten service? They said, absolutely. So, the thing is, if I didn't kind of require that along the way, they never would have gotten to this point now where they appreciate those practices and they will want to continue doing them. So, the point is, while they're in your home, matters of spirituality are things that the parents decide. I got to say, even now, our kids are 20. They're both in college. They both are away at college during the school year. When they come home, even during the summers, there's times when they still rail against me when I'm trying to get them to church on Sunday morning. Now where they go out on Saturday night and up late and everything. But, in fact, just recently, I don't know if it was my son or daughter said, I'm 20, I don't have to go you can't make me go to church. And I said, yes, I can. As long as you're in this house, I don't force you to do anything spiritual while you're at school. That's, I hope you do, but that's your business. But when you're here, sort of, I hate to sound old-fashioned, under my roof, you're going to go to church, and we do. So, I think that we got to remember there's just certain things that, as a parent, you have a right to do, but also an obligation to do, because it's in your kid's best interest. And, matters of spirituality, I put that at the very top of my priority list for the important things that we teach our kids. The fourth point of sort of old school parenting is, talk to your kids about just about everything. Don't be overly protective about keeping things from them because it might upset them, or, maybe you feel like it's a little too, advanced or too mature for where they are in their lives. I mean, I believe right from the very beginning, share with your kids just about everything and, expose them to sort of the realities of life. In this era, probably that's more important than ever because kids get exposed to things through social media, things that would be, shocking if you knew what they saw, at a very, very young age. I remember, we would have our kind of spiritual time at night. We kind of sit in bed and read the Bible. And that's when I would just talk to my kids, just talking about everything. And I remember talking to them about, alcohol, drugs, from the time they were little kids, maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. And I would say to them, on alcohol, alcohol is legal. A lot of adults indulge in alcohol. It's in moderation. It's not a horrible thing. But I would say, but guys, if you go through your life and you never have a single drink, you'll be better off. And I think sort of the new approach to parenting is you don't talk to your kids about consuming alcohol when they're 4 years old. I don't agree with that. I feel like they get exposed to that stuff so early. If you don't talk about it right away, then they're going to hear it from everybody out there in the world, and that's where you don't want them learning it from that source. Same with drugs. I would talk about marijuana, even some of the harder drugs. Preparing them, getting them to understand, at a very young age, why those are so attractive, appealing to some people, and how destructive they are. So they get the whole concept. They've got the concept of, to some extent, addiction. And right from day one, I said, guys, a lot of kids, a lot of people smoke marijuana. It makes you feel makes you feel in the moment. They think they feel good, but even the drug use, it's so destructive. It's so toxic. And I said, I don't want you ever even trying it. Don't ever touch it. And I got to say, when the kids were in middle school, a lot of their friends, I would say just about every single one of them were trying marijuana, smoking marijuana, and that continued through high school and college. And in our world, nowadays it's like, the youth, it's just about everybody partakes. In the state I live in, Massachusetts, it's legal, it's everywhere. But my son, he very social. He was always, popular kid, athletic, had a lot of friends. I would say just about every one of them at least tried marijuana. To this day, he's 20 years old, and I believe this because I've heard this from, his friends' parents all the time. My son has never touched marijuana. He's probably one of the only kids in that entire group that has never tried it. And not too long ago, I said to him, Christopher, I'm just really curious, what stopped you? What stopped you from smoking, trying marijuana, or I guess they take edibles nowadays? And he paused for a moment. He said, because you told me not to. And I was just like, oh man, that's so awesome. It was just out of love for his dad, knew how much I cared about him. Like, that was enough for him to never partake of it. And I felt so proud. Another point that I talk to my kids about very, very young, and a lot of people wouldn't agree with this, is about sexual orientation and, transgender individuals and roles and that sort of thing. I remember the first time it came up, we had just moved to this house, so the kids were probably like 3 years old, and I had on TV, it was a PBS show, and there were two men. I believe they were married, but they were a couple. And the kids were in the room with me, and I brought it up. I said, "Hey guys, those two men are married. They're a couple together," and they were a little kind of confused. And I said, "Yeah, so men and women can fall in love. Two men can fall in love. Two women can fall in love. It depends on your preference. It depends on." Sort of how you were born. Some men are attracted to men. Some men are attracted to women. And I went through the whole thing. And they kind of like listened, And I said, but here's the thing. There's some people who believe that if you're a man and you love another man, or woman love another woman, that's sinful. And by the way, the kids know I'm a pretty staunch Christian. But I said to them, I don't believe that. I don't believe God believes that. God created, heterosexual people, which is men and women who are attracted to each other, and homosexual people. And the kids were kind of like, oh, okay. They were like fine with it. They didn't see anything weird about that. And I said, but here's the thing. There's some people, who are, men who love women, women who love men. They get really hateful of same-sex couples. Two men, two women. They treat them, or they make fun of them, or they treat them badly. And I don't want you ever to do that. And the interesting thing was, my daughter, I remember she said something like, why? Why would they? Why? And it didn't make sense to her that, you would discriminate against somebody based on their sexual orientation. Now, I'm using sort of, mature language, but in her perception, it was like, well, why would people dislike them just if a man likes another man? And then, we started talking about even bigotry in terms of race and ethnicity. And it was kind of the same thing. Like, why would, a white person, dislike somebody because of the color of their skin, or a black person dislike somebody because of the color of their skin? And again, it just didn't make sense to them. But I'm so glad I had that conversation. And I got to tell you, it was a couple of years later, I was at a parent-teacher conference, and our kids are twins, so my wife would take, my son, and I would take my daughter, vice versa, we'd swap. But I was in the conference for my daughter, who was at the time, I think it was second grade. And we were in the kids had like their little desks in clusters. So we just sat at those. The parents sat at those. It was in the evening. And the teacher talked to the class. But, for one of them, we were waiting for the teacher to start the conversation about, the class that she was teaching to our children. And there was a lady sitting across from me in the little cluster, like right across. We introduced ourselves, and I said, "Oh, I'm Coco's dad." And she said, "Oh my God, I'm so happy to meet you. My son is AJ." And I said, "Oh yeah, Coco loves AJ. Yeah, I'm so glad they're friends and all that." And AJ and his mom were African American, and she said, "I got to tell you how appreciative I am that your daughter was so kind to my son. There was one day." The kids were picking on him, for, basically for the color of his skin. And, he was sitting by himself and really sad. And Coco came up to him and just asked what was wrong. And, they talked about it. And she was so kind to him, and so helpful. And I was just, again, I'm so proud of my daughter, and I do think there was some impact of talking about these things to our kids when they were very young, including, the destructiveness of bigotry and racism and homophobic attitudes. So, really glad I did that, and something I recommend for all parents. So the fifth and final point I want to make in terms of sort of the benefits of the old-fashioned way of parenting, and that is that you can't be afraid to impose some real impactful consequences on your kids, particularly when their behavior crosses a line. I think folks nowadays, parents, they're just so worried about, making their kids sad or upset or feeling like they're being mistreated that they just let their kids get away with stuff. And it's so bad for the kids. As a result, I think there's a lot of, very spoiled, kind of messed up adults out there, because they were never taught that there are consequences for things that you do that cross a line. For my kids, my kids were generally really good kids, but when they did something that, particularly if it put their safety at risk or just really disrespectful, and there were times when they just mouthed off, and I gave them like 2 or 3 chances, but there was a line, and after that it was like they had consequences that were, again, kind of matched the crime. I remember one time we were kind of hanging out with friends of ours, and the wife, Joyce, she had a picture, and it was kind of in real time. It had just been they posted, her daughter and my son posted this, and they were sitting on the roof of the kids' elementary school, 2 stories above the ground with their feet dangling off and they weren't like, 18, 19 years old. They were like in middle school. And I kind of flipped out because I thought, like, my God, if he fell off or he or she fell off, they would have, broken their legs or worse. So, he got in major trouble for that. Same with my daughter. Some of the stuff she did with social media or, the kids going out at night were really bad. And, there were times when, I would impose like real, I guess you call it hard labor, yard work. We call it the Peace Garden. It's like this semicircle, like halfway up the driveway. It's all like very decorative gravel. And a lot of weeds grow up there. And I forgot what they did. The 2 of them did it together. I forgot what it was. But anyway, I said to them, guys, every single weed in that garden better be pulled up today, or you're not going to, the birthday party tonight or the soccer game or whatever it was. And it was hard. They were on their hands and knees pulling weeds, and I think it was like really hot out. But I think, again, they're going to help them realize that, there are consequences to what you do. But also another lesson, which is, hard work isn't going to kill you. Like, really, like, I think I wanted my kids to know, like, that, you can work really hard for a few hours outside, and, it's not going to be super comfortable, and, you're maybe your back's going to ache a little bit, your knees from, getting on your hands and knees and weeding. but you'll be okay. And you know, and there were times even when it was a consequence where they had to do yard work. I know they felt pride at the end of it because they saw the product of their work. So you know, the point there is, you know, you're not doing it to be me. I mean, I said this at the outset. I don't believe in hitting kids. I don't believe in being mean to kids or, you know, denigrating them or making them feel bad about themselves. But I do believe that if you don't impose, you know, punishments for when they, you know, misbehave really, really badly, you're doing them a disservice. And it's not easy. It's not easy imposing some of these consequences on them. I mean, there were times when, you know, I wouldn't let my daughter go on a school field trip. Or I remember there was a Halloween. My son, I think he hit some kid in school, and I just felt like, and it was really kind of brutal the way he just punched this kid. He didn't get to go trick or treating, and he was only in like maybe second or third grade, and to not get to go trick or treating for Halloween, you know, it's a big deal. So again, it wasn't easy for me. I mean, I kind of was sad for him, but I also knew like that was required. Like the punishment had to fit the crime. And again, I love my kids, and it's for their own good in the long run. So, in the interest of full disclosure, I do need to say there are a couple areas that I'm not old school. Just I feel like I need to, you know, lay it out there, be honest about that. You know, and one has to do with the kids' safety. I think sort of the world I grew up in, you know, your parents sent you out in the morning and you didn't come back at the end of the day. And there's some real value to that, but they weren't just overly obsessed with, you know, safety of us. I mean, I got to say, back then, I don't think parents thought about it that much. I do obsess about it a little bit. Maybe obsess isn't the right word because that implies that, you know, it was kind of an emotional thing. No, I think that I was very careful about the kids' safety all along, and I don't regret that. You know, one example, which I think some people thought was a little extreme, was, you know, when Christopher was probably maybe fifth grade, the kids started playing football in recess, and you know, when they got together for, you know, play groups, you know, after school, and there was always tackle football, and I knew that, and I just read a lot of information about, you know, the negative impacts of football generally, just the impacts, particularly of tackle football. And of course, when they played at recess or just on play dates, they weren't wearing padding or helmets. You know, so I worried about concussions, or just even if something didn't rise to the level of a concussion, just the impacts to the head. You know, there's just data that can have true, you know, significant long-term adverse effects on kids' cognitive abilities and even worse. So I remember at one point I sent an email to Christopher's friends' dads and saying, look, you know, I'm making a request, you know, when Christopher's over, if the kids are playing football, you know, I appreciate if you're around, you know, making sure he sits out. I've already told him he's not allowed to play football. You know, and most of the fathers understood and, you know, either didn't say anything or were like, yeah, sure, you know, we'll happy to do that. One or two of them, I think, were kind of like, what? Like, kind of, you know, like, not like, don't tell me what to do at my house, but we're a little more like, you know, if the kids are going to play, they're going to play, you know. So, but you know, and I know they were probably like laughing behind my back, but, you know, I didn't care. And I let Christopher know, like, if I find out, you know, you're playing tackle football, there's going to be a consequence to that. So, again, like, I sound like one of the newfangled parents there, and I don't care because that's something I worry about, like kid safety. You know, a lot of parents, when their kids, you know, go out at night, you know, they say, you know, I got to trust them. You know, they got to learn the hard way. You know, they might make mistakes. You know, driving, whatever. You know, I don't buy into that. You know, when my kids go out to this day, you know, and they're 20 years old. Whenever they're out, I text them. I want to know where they are. I want to know, check in on them. You know, if they don't respond right away, I call them. You know, again, sounding like a little like a helicopter parent, but you know, we live in a tough world, and I think it's gotten worse than it was even when I was growing up. So, you know, if people call me the helicopter dad or that I'm just, you know, paranoid or scared, I don't care. That's something that I worry about my kids. I love my kids. Let people say whatever they want. So that's it. Again, if you enjoyed this video, if you got any benefit from it, I would love it if you subscribed and became part of my community. And we'll see you next time.